Sandy's marvelous article on the exhibit as it traveled in the New York Review of Books had the wonderful title, The Wild Card. Don't you wish, I wish I'd thought of that. Yeah. But I'd like to ask Sandy, I'd like to ask, is that hearable? What exactly, when you talk about Catlin as the wild card, did you mean?
Well, okay, can you hear me? In some ways, I'm very proud of the title, The Wild Card, because most of my articles in the New York Review of Books have titles that I either don't want or they play with my titles, and The Wild Card was my own title, which they accepted. But now, when Benita was asking me about this, I realized I forgot what I meant, and I looked at the article again and kind of snooped around, and I think what I meant was, at the time, in talking about him as a wild card, it was because I felt that in his work he brought together academic skills as a painter, and at the same time the audacity of a folk artist or an untaught painter. And both of those were in his work vividly, and in the sense that a wild card is something you can pull out of the deck, and it can be anything. There is that quality in Catlin, not only I think in his having two styles in a sense, and I don't know if that became clear or is in any way understandable looking at these reproductions, but there is a sense that he draws, if not academically, at least draws facial features in a way that have the dimensionality and the depth of a trained artist, and does a lot of other things in these pictures that has a kind of a freeformness, a wildness, and a lack of that naturalistic modulation that is more like a folk artist or an untrained artist. But in thinking about the term wild card, I was also thinking that in a much larger sense, he's a wild card, because maybe not as a lawyer, because his career as an attorney was pretty modest and pretty brief and pretty much a failure, but as a painter and as a writer, and he's a really good writer. I highly recommend is it a Penguin paperback?
Dover.
Yeah, it's really readable. He's a wonderful writer. He was a showman, which is what he became in London and in Paris. And in reading Benita's book, there are pages and pages, and you forget completely that this man was ever a writer or a painter. I mean, he's really involved with show business. And then he's an ethnologist, because he was putting together stuff as an ethnologist would. So he has at least these 4 different terrains that he's quite knowledgeable at and quite good at. And then, yet again, there's another area where this wild card idea I think might possibly work, and that is that he's usually treated as a painter of Indians and American Indian life. And at the same time, he's really a portraitist. And he's not thought about so much as a portraitist per se. I think he's probably the great American portraitist in 19th century American painting before Akins. I mean, I've been looking at a lot of portraits of the 1840s and 50s and so forth, and as a body of portraiture, I think I don't know that anyone really compares with him in terms of the depth of feeling. And then finally, he's also a wonderful landscape painter, because
I think his landscapes are the most underrated.
Yeah, so there are all these areas in which he kind of like fills a bill, and he's always moving his hat around, and he plays all these different parts. So that's really what I meant. I didn't really mean all of that when I wrote my article, but now I mean.
Now you do. Well, see, it just takes being challenged. But I wonder, one doesn't want to get into sort of identity politics and racial issues, but when you say that he's a marvelous portraitist, which I absolutely agree with, I wonder if those portraits had not been of Indians, which become a sort of, let's say, generic. There's a part because of the marvelous makeup, and you describe that so incredibly, of the red. To go into this gallery and see all of this red face paint, I mean, it's an overwhelming experience. If it doesn't somehow, if that same talent hadn't somehow been able to flower with white sitters, with you know, whether he would have been seen more of a portraitist as opposed to the ethnographic. For years, for decades, he was called an ethnologist because nobody else had ever seen or lived with or spent any time at these tribes. It was almost by default. I mean, he was the only one, Lewis and Clark, sort of spent a little time, but not really involved with the tribes and their games and their practices and their meals. I mean, he was eating stewed dog, yum yum, you know, I mean, whatever he was invited to do, he was up for. I mean, true participant observer. I mean, the Boazes, et cetera, who came way later, had nothing, whatever on him. The other remark which you somewhat alluded to already, which is that Sandy refers to Catlin as a virtuoso, which in the essays that go with the catalog, there's so much ja-nining, as my German husband says, that we're, oh, well, he's a very interesting painter, but not really a terrific painter. And in effect, you're calling him a virtuoso. Is that referring to what aspect of his art? The drawing, the painting, how would you fit him in with the term virtuoso?
Well, by the way, I did find him described as a virtuoso by an art historian since we spoke. A really good one, a man named James Thomas Flexner. Who wrote that Wilder Image.
He wrote a book a week at some point.
Yeah, he wrote a book a week, and he wrote a award-winning biography of George Washington, and but he also wrote, I think, really great books on American 19th century and late 18th century painting, and he also called him a virtuoso. On the other hand, another authority, Edgar Richardson, said too often hurried and careless in his observation and crude in style, so that his work does not go very deep nor get very far beyond the obvious and picturesque. So that's, and in addition, Barbara Novak, who's one of the eminent writers, I think, on 19th century American painting, does not include him in her book. So I realize I'm sort of on a minority on this, but I think they're fabulous paintings, and I think that they have a lot. The man had to be a virtuoso and a daredevil to do what he did in his life to begin with, and I think you feel that and see that in the actual works when you're before them, hopefully to some extent, and looking at them here as well. They're really complicated as paintings, and they're full of bravura. I think he started with a kind of dry brush and indicating facial features, usually in black, and that aspect tends to have depth, tends to have a naturalistic modulation of the kind that you would expect from a trained painter, which he was to some degree. But then he does other things that a trained painter, an academic painter, would not do, with the face paint, with the decoration on the bodies, which he treats almost as a collage. Because, I mean, when he puts the facial makeup on, when you're standing in front of these paintings, the facial makeup really feels like a collage. It feels like another unit that is not just carefully painted in, but rather something that's been slapped on. And the backgrounds tend to be hit or miss, sort of sky, you know, he's not that interested, and often he loses energy because he had to work fast. So in some of the full lengths, you see that the bodies are kind of half done and whatever. And I think of this as virtuosity in the sense that in that his pictures are like machines. They have different elements going, different kinds of techniques that I don't feel a more modest, careful, modulated painter would ever have dared to do. So that's really what I mean by a virtuoso. I mean, I think he's a real swift guy. I mean, you know, that was what I meant by that. And well, as I said, Flexner agrees. So it's got to be right. I mean,
well, they'll probably revive Flexner. Also, you know, it's an interesting point quickly to be made about the rise and decline of interest in American art. Because when I was an undergraduate, it was at its height, and there was a wonderful writer, not a great scholar, but a marvelous writer who won a Pulitzer Prize, Oliver Larkin, who taught at Smith, and wrote a narrative history of American art, a wonderful book. And I've come to think that it was a product of the Cold War, that the height of interest in American art, including, and he includes Catlin as well, is that it was a kind of learn about America. I had a classmate who was the first person I ever saw who wore an American flag pin, jeweled, and explained why she majored in American studies, which was a product of this period. And she said that Daddy says that in order to fight communism, we have to know more about our own country. And I think in a backdoor way, it produced the biggest rise of interest in American art, which has now descended in some rather inexplicable way to me, where the Western History Association doesn't even bother with it, nor does college art to any great extent. I mean, it's like a kind of a ghetto. And I'm wondering why, I mean, you might not agree with this, but you've sort of pointed very interestingly to reasons for Catlin's obscurity. So maybe you would want to address that briefly.
Yeah. Well, just to take a step back, one thing about an earlier period's interest in American art may have had to do with the fact that when you say American art, you mean kind of like 19th century.
Right. Yeah.
Earlier on, there was just more of it available on the market. And if auction houses are happy and dealers are happy, and there's a lot of it, there's a fluidity with the material itself, it tends to excite, or can at times, generate an interest on the part of scholars, and that was the rise of American Studies department. And like anything in the academic and the world of auction houses, when the material feels the sense that the material is overused, we move on to other material and other ways of looking at it. But I think that one reason why he's kind of in this particular, I mean, Catlin is both a famous artist and an unknown artist. I mean, I think he's really unknown, essentially, and I think it's because of the nature of of his desire. It's really tragic, and the story is really just bound up with this strange fate. He wanted to keep all these things together, the ethnographic material as well as the paintings, the costumes, the teepees, the whole works. It was meant to be the Indian gallery. It was desperate for him to keep it together and not sell it piecemeal. It wound up being kept together. It's at the Smithsonian, which is in some ways one of the, is anyone here from the Smithsonian? It's one of the worst places in the world for this material to be.
It is.
You really can't see it. You correct me, but I think they've only had, in all the years they've had it, which date to the 1890s, whenever the bequest was.
Yeah, 1870s.
Since the 90s, there have been like maybe 3 times that they've carted it out to show you the material in its entirety. It should not be seen in its entirety, nor should it be seen the way it is now, which is when you go to the Smithsonian, they're on a stairwell, and you never really
You have to be
can see
held by
these
the
things.
ankles so that you don't fall down 4 flights of stairs.
This material is completely unavailable in an easygoing way, the way most other paintings would be at the Smithsonian. And he's not represented by paintings of this quality anywhere else. You can't go to the Met, you can't go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, you can't go anywhere and see a Catlin. I have mentioned Catlin to many of my friends who are really well versed, and they know who Martin Johnson Heat is, and they've heard about Remington. They don't know who he is. They just
That's
don't
exactly
know.
Mark's words.
Because the Smithsonian, I guess you could say, guards them, or whatever they do with them, you just don't see them. And when I saw the show in 2002, was it the big one, the last big show? I mean, you went into a room and there were like 200 paintings in one room, and they're all the same size. They're 29 by 24. They all have the same frame, which is nice in a way, but you need binoculars. It's worse than the old barns. It's really doesn't, you can't see them. And the color is amazing. You need to have 2 at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. You need to have 2 in San Francisco. You need to have 1 or 2 at the Phillips in Washington. You need them dispersed. And then people will understand that he's part of American art history, as opposed to the history of our encounter with the Indians. So that's
sort of tragic episode. They're in a ghetto. I mean, it's like a sort of perpetuation in a racial sense, except unintended to a large degree. I'm going to suggest that, does anyone have any questions?
I'm wondering if any of them are any paintings or in private collections.
There are some.
The Niagara series, of which you saw the strange hokusai, like, which are 8 paintings, all square in format, are in one private collection, which has had great other. I beg pardon. One was lent to a very amazing show that had a scientific theme, which was where? It was in Washington, and it was on Peale and his influence. A very interesting show. It was on Peale and his influence on physics and biology, all the Peale family, every one of them. And there was one of the Niagara paintings had been lent to show the sort of interest in its influence on kind of engineering and its fascination for scientists. So there were scientific drawings, and that was one of them that was lent, and I've never seen another from this collection lent.
Isn't it?
There are paintings in Versailles, I think, and a strange museum, which I have to confess I've never been to, in some Paris suburb. It's a museum of American art, and I think they have a couple of Catlin drawings. I have no idea what else they have, but it's in one of those strange suburbs that turned into a sort of an automobile factory, Coulancourt or something or other. And I certainly should have gone, but I've never heard anybody else having gone there either.
No. But the thing is that they're about 400 to 500 core paintings, portraits, and these landscape views. And so to find out that there are some Catlins in a private collection, or maybe some in a French collection, or maybe 1 or 2 in Scotland or in Minsk, doesn't really matter, because what you want are these great paintings from the 1830s that show him at his best. There are other things that dribbled out over the years, and they could be anywhere, but you want the great stuff, and that's all locked up in one place.
And also the other point is that in the Smithsonian, what mostly is there are tourists and school kids chained by the neck, or at least sprung for the day on a field trip. So I've never, in my numerous trips there, I don't think I've ever seen anybody come to see, or then nobody seemed to be there to see the Catlins. It was part of a big Washington tourist mega trip, along with the Air and Space Museum, etc.
There is a show now, by the way, in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, at the National Wildlife Museum, a show of 40 paintings having to do with the buffalo. And I called them up, and they're not just images of buffalo, but they're also a few portraits of Indians who happen to be wearing buffalo skins. So if you want to, and that Jackson Hole show of 40 works is going to Palm Springs, and then it's winding up in North Carolina. So look it up. It could be a great summer trip.
Yes.
So struck by your comments on virtuosity, because it seems to me that Europeans were much more responsive to that element than Americans in the 19th century. For instance, Louis Philippe and Delacroix, these people were much more enthusiastic than any figures I can think of in America at the same time. And do you have any explanation for this greater openness of Europeans to these art than to Americans?
Well, I think probably the best criticism he got, or certainly the most enthusiastic, at least in Europe, was from Baudelaire, when 2 paintings were shown in one of the salons, and Baudelaire said something kind of nice. He said, "And Catlin's color is terrible." And what he meant by terrible was almost synonymous with sublime or extraordinary.
Ferocious.
Ferocious.
It's frightening.
He used the word terrible, which, and the connotation could be anything. And I think that's because Baudelaire's enthusiasm was for the color, which still stands out and still seems extraordinary, although in some ways it's the color of a number of folk artists. And the artist he's closest to is a landscape painter named Thomas Chambers, whose color is equally psychedelic. It's fabulous. And academic painters in the States in the 1830s to the 50s weren't capable of color like this. It wasn't of interest to them. So I think that would be one element why a European would wake up. And because the strong reds and other, Delacroix was on that track. But Delacroix kind of, without saying that he's a better artist than Delacroix. Delacroix sort of modulates that brilliant color. And this guy just throws it out at you. They're really strong.
It has a sort of magic realism. Those landscapes are knockout, original, and weird. I mean, they are so strange. I was saying that maybe metaphorically, they made me think of the sort of trinity or the explosion of the atom bomb. They seem to be waiting for some awful event. They have a kind of airless, suspended in time feeling with a very ominous undertone. I mean, maybe that's the sort of pathetic fallacy. Other people find it very cheerful and green. But they're not a green that you expect to grow anything. I mean, they're just that sort of almost a kind of dead green. And Sandy made the point in his long original piece that they seem to be a green that came straight from the tube.
Yeah, he had to work from the tube. I mean, there's the circumstances that the timing was such that he pretty much did that. There wasn't a lot of space or time for careful mixing of color.
Yes.
I'm interested in how you got interested in them. How did you find them?
I saw that show.
Oh, you saw that show?
Literally like another tourist. My best friend lives in Washington, and I stay when she comes here, and we do art blitzes. And when I visit there, if there's this show to be seen, and I was sort of interested in who's this guy, as you said, I'd never heard of him, or vaguely. And I was so utterly knocked out, even with this weird, it sort of does look a little like the salon hangings of Eight Deep for the show. But even then, I mean, it was such an extraordinary experience. What you could see was so knockout, and these portraits collectively have a sort of tragic weight. So I went several more times, and I thought, where's the book on this guy? I mean, the catalog had, first of all, a very kind of nervous aspect to it, which you pointed to. They seemed to be disapproving of a lot of him because in this kind of ignorant way that he didn't have the approved, sort of political attitudes, and he actually turned into a showman, and he was, but so they sort of took a very nervous view of the art, even the catalog entries.
Wonderful. Well, at this time, I'd like to thank you guys for coming to the Strand. Thank you, Benita. Thank you, Sandy. And thank you all for coming to join us. Make sure you check out Red Man's Bones before you leave the Rare Book Room. Have a great evening.